but primarily we are going to be talking about how people at the moment, illusions, right? People at the moment, I'm finding across Twitter, social media in general, there's a camp of people who are looking at this current pandemic with COVID-19 coronavirus as a hoax, right? People who are looking at it to distrust the government and distrust news and media in general, they are seeing it as something, as a propaganda play, and that all of this, staying at home, etc. stuff is unnecessary. Now, I can actually really understand why people think that, but let's just take a look at some things. So, I'm sure you've heard some people talk about this, right? How COVID-19 is not really that much. Is not really that dangerous compared to the common flu. And of course, I guess it was easy enough to say this when things were just breaking out and just starting, right? You can't always see the forest from the trees. You can't always see that far out. And so here you can see what the actual data is now as, and this was of March 18th. So I'm sure that this is accelerated a lot more. So as you can see, right, this is just for the US. We don't know what the global numbers are, but I'm sure for those of you who are stats inclined, you could probably go out and look for those. Now, the problem here is that we live in an age where there is so much information out. There's a lot of distrust in the West in general. And so it's very easy to get facts and data that supports what you believe. So for me, I'm always looking at both sides. At the beginning, I got to say, I got to admit that I did take on the belief too that, hey, this isn't as bad as the flu, so just treat it like the flu. And I actually went traveling for work as a result of that. But then as things started to rapidly increase, what made it real is when people and people who know others that may have either died from COVID-19 or experienced the symptoms, right? And when you start to get those firsthand accounts, that's when things become real. Right now, I think a lot of the people who are still, sort of denying everything, they sound no different to people who are. Sorry, I just realized that we've got the chat function of this entire live stream working, so that's great. So I just had a friend named Adam say hello, so hi Adam. But yeah, in general, just seeing how right now people who are denying things about COVID-19 sound very similar to people who denied climate change. And I'm not taking away anything when it comes to, the stats, right? It's always important to keep things in perspective. But there's a danger in sort of being, sitting in your ivory tower and giving out those sort of comments. Because I remember when I was doing customer support, right, we would have people on the front lines say that particular problems kept coming up and that we felt like they needed to be addressed. And then when we would sort of bring it back to headquarters, the people who were not on the front lines would say, well, statistically looking, this is only like 2% of our actual problems. And so they didn't really take it seriously. The thing here is that those on the front lines can also get an idea of what is going to be happening in the future as a result of things that they might be feeling or experiencing on the ground. So just because statistically things are not showing right now that it's bad, doesn't mean that you can't have a preventative outlook or take preventative measures, right? Because if something doesn't happen, then people just go, oh, well, you see, it wasn't as bad. But people don't take into account the preventative measures that might have taken place earlier on to prevent that from happening, And this is the difference that I find between, say, Western and Eastern philosophies, which is what you're currently seeing out in the market, right? And in the globe, right, we're seeing the clash between, actually, in my opinion, Western and Eastern philosophies, right? You see in the East, right, it was very much, many countries were able to stop things early, take preventative measures, and for many in the West, sounded very draconian, take those preventative measures and prevent, actually control and contain. Now, on the reverse, you can see what's happening in the U.S., and many other Western countries. They are struggling, right? All of their values around freedom, around liberty, around independence, individualism is actually sort of working against them right now. So this is a quote that is being shared on Twitter. Twitter is I have a love and hate relationship with Twitter. But here you can see the end of democracy and the defeat of the American Revolution will occur when government falls into the hands of lending institutions and moneyed corporations. So as a result of everything that's taking place, it's really increasing tension between the people and its governments. There was an article that was circling about, I'm not too sure, can't remember if I talked about it yesterday, about how essentially what has happened now is that the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve have somehow combined. And what this means is that the new, essentially, chairman of all that is Donald Trump, which has put an unprecedented amount of power into one person and one group, unlike anything ever before. And all of this is happening sort of openly, but because there's so much attention elsewhere, right, say on the coronavirus, these things you also need to pay attention to because it will have huge ramifications in the future. But how this ties into COVID-19 and what I was just talking about in terms of the clash between philosophies. In the U.S., you would have seen the rise in populism around and socialism, right? There's been a huge sort of uptake in, especially the younger generations, of people who are fans of socialism and are wanting more of a democratic socialism. But there's something that you should look up if you haven't already heard about this. It is called The Tragedy of the Commons. So if you haven't heard of The Tragedy of the Commons before, it's essentially like a cautionary tale, right, of what happens when you sort of just try to even the playing field for everybody. I personally, once upon a time in my uni days, I probably was a fan of this, but the more I learned, the more I understood, it actually becomes unequal for people. If you've ever been in a work environment where, everybody sort of gets rewarded for everything, then you actually don't feel motivated, right, to do better because, everybody's going to get sort of the same reward for whatever effort. And this goes back to sort of in our education system, there was a trend of the participation award, right? Everybody needs to get an award because we needed to make everybody feel included. But you often hear me talk, right, a lot about wolves, and there's merit in meritocracies. I think there's been a lot of experiments for governments and nations around meritocracy, Singapore being one of them, and many other mighty civilizations. But it's very interesting because there's always a trend that it might start off very noble and meritocratic, then it will end up in as something more socialist. And I'm always looking at the balance between individualism and collectivism. I don't know if we can ever have that, but I definitely do see swings between that, right? And I think it's all about extremes. You go too extreme to one side, and you snap back to the other side. So the next one I wanted to show you guys was here. I think the dollar is going to be a lot weaker in this decade than it was in the 1970s. If you haven't heard of Peter Schiff, he's a guy that has often sort of been, he's become popular for talking about how shitty Bitcoin is, to put it bluntly, and how he thinks, gold is still very much a strong store of value during these times. Throughout history, if you're watching this and you're not familiar with the history of money in general, throughout history, whenever a civilization has sort of collapsed, a lot of the population ends up going back to gold because gold throughout time immemorial has been able to retain its value. And so him and a fair few others have said during this time gold will have a rally and it'll become even more valuable. But we shall see. So in this article, gotta love ads, Americans are in for a rude awakening. I think, because the Americans have been sort of the shining beacon, right, for our current Western civilization for the time being, I think they're getting a rude awakening because they have to come to terms with the fact that they are no longer as great as they once were. Similar to the Greeks, if anybody's been to Greece, there's a lot of sort of lamenting over the past, and, it's good to be proud of your history, but it is also history, and I think one of the things that I've been a big proponent of is essentially I feel that a lot of power is going to shift from the west to the east, despite what we see going on in the world right now, and despite the fact that the U.S. is still one of the biggest superpowers. I think over time it's just the pendulum's going to swing back. So yeah, Again, as always, I will share these articles for those of you that are interested. The reason why I talk a lot about the economic side is because actually, I never used to be a big finance or economics or money person. But when I started learning about the history of money and how it ties into so many other areas of our society, right? Money makes the world go round. It really started to make me more interested in the dynamics between money and everything else. And I think people who fail to learn about it or understand, they are completely dumbfounded when things like that happen, and it's such a shame. I really think that it should be taught in schools, just the basics of money and the history of it, because you'll be surprised by just how many conflicts and how many issues in our world have an element of money being part of the root cause. Not saying that money's evil. I'm just saying that like the way that we use it. So there's that. Another thing I wanted to share too is that if you've been following along, right, or if you're part of a workplace that has been using remote tools, right, to work better together, Slack is one that I've been using for a long while. It's similar to Microsoft Teams. Microsoft Teams kind of took the same idea concept. And fun fact, Microsoft actually almost bought Slack out, but they decided to compete instead. And I just wanted to share this article for those of you who are, of course, find yourself working from home. These are some really good bots for Slack. And if you haven't tried Slack out, just go to slackhq.com or slack.com. And one of the bots or integrations, it's similar to sort of like your Chrome extensions, is, if you use Zoom, you could actually just pull up Zoom straight away from within a Slack conversation. Here for sharing video, Loom, I love Loom. It's great for recording instructional videos and how-to guides. Stand-Uply, so if you're familiar with the sort of agile Scrum methodology, where essentially every day your team, gets up and stands up and asks each other, what did you do yesterday? What do you plan on doing today? Any obstacles? This provides you with a simple bot that asks everybody in their own time zone. You answer it, and it publishes into a single channel. Clockwise is just it allows you to sync your calendar with your Slack status. This one, Donut, I remember talking to the team at Donut a little while back. This is great for larger teams or larger organizations for just sort of queuing up, setting up times for people to meet every week, and it's actually pretty cool. Poly for polls, and Disco for sort of giving praise to one another. So I will include this link in the comments box after the show is done. And I'm going to put up this article. So here, this is another one from Bill Gates, who is kind of, become very well known now for having predicted this and trying to inform everybody around the world about how really, in general, the world is not ready for a pandemic. And what's happening right now, it is really showing that that is the case. And so, now we obviously have the issue or the situation that we are in. And he's saying, the trouble with the U.S. right now is that because they don't have central planning and they aren't able to get their country to rally together quickly, easily, and centrally, the state-by-state shutdown approach is not working, and it won't work, right? You compare that to places like in Asia, right, where people often, especially in the West, would like to criticize the East for being either draconian or centralized or not having enough of a democracy. But in times of crisis, you can see just how useful centralization is, right? And to all my blockchain people in the Bitcoin, Ethereum worlds, this is an example of where decentralization does not work, right? I'm a big fan of yin yang, and there's a time for centralization and a time for decentralization. Right now, in my opinion, this is a time for centralization of efforts, for us to know exactly where we all need to go, what everybody needs to do, and to get it done. Right now, because of, I guess, the individualism of the United States, right, and the way that they're just set up, they're struggling to coordinate, right? They really are struggling to coordinate. There's a lot of great efforts, good things happening, but again, it's just highlighting the tension between sort of belief systems in the world, and it's just so fascinating to watch and see. Finally, yes, because if you're not already in the know, this particular show is sponsored by Faya, which is my collection of companies that deals with communities in technology. We are specialists in Bitcoin BSV. I might have another episode to talk about the differences between the three main Bitcoins that are out in the market right now. But this particular article was shared or announced recently by one of our previous clients, and it's talking about bringing peer-to-peer back to Bitcoin. I won't go into too much of the technical details, but what this essentially means is that there's been a lot of misconceptions around Bitcoin in general, and it's been perpetuated over the last decade. And what we're seeing now in the Bitcoin SV camp is that they're really starting to show the world what Bitcoin was always capable of. All right, and so miners essentially operate in something called a small world network, and peer-to-peer users are the ones who, if I was wanting to send money to you, I should be able to send it to you straight away without the need for a trusted third party, right? And again, if this is going way over your head, it's all right, but I'm going to include these articles for people who are familiar with this space, okay? And so with that, that brings us to the end of today's show. But tune in every day. It's at 11:11 a.m. Singapore time. I will start to include those in the show sort of cover graphics. And thank you for tuning in. I know that right now things are definitely tense for a lot of folks. Every day I'm hearing new news, friends and grandparents of friends who are dying and losing their jobs. So despite all of this, I am always hopeful. This show is a testament to that, to know that it will come, right? So that whatever it is you're experiencing, know that if you can just put yourself a little bit into the future, into the near future, through patience and persistence, whatever it is you seek, it will come and it can come. And with that, final sign off for today's episode, through patience and persistence, it will come.